So thank you very much everyone for joining us today for our first diversity and inclusion seminar. Today we're going to be focusing on recruitment best practice. So just to introduce myself, my name's Catherine Kellaway. I'm one of the directors at Goodman Masson. Diversity and inclusion I'm really passionate about, and internally at Goodman Masson I've recently taken the lead on our diversity and inclusion change programme. Externally, I think we're really lucky as recruiters and well positioned to support clients with ensuring diversity and inclusion best practice and supporting clients in achieving diversity and inclusion related goals in the hiring process and with the talent that that people attract. One of the initiatives of our change programme was actually to appoint a non-executive director, and we're lucky enough today to actually have Lenna join us and actually support the webinar today. This is the first series, as I mentioned, and we've actually signed Lenna up to do a second webinar around diversity and inclusion strategy. But today, as I mentioned, we're going to focus on the recruitment process. So Lenna, over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. It's really great to be able to join you here. Yes, I'm absolutely ecstatic to be joining Goodman Masson as a NED recently, and so I'm currently engaged in my PhD in diversity and inclusion strategy at the University of St Andrews, but I've been working, broadly speaking, in diversity and inclusion for about 20 years. In the most recent past, I've been working for places like the Wellcome Trust, the Royal Society, or the University of Cambridge. So I'm really glad to be able to join you today. Essentially, what we're going to be covering today in terms of our content, we're going to be looking at how we address our data imbalances. So, what is it exactly what methods we can use and how we can use them. We're going to be seeing what can we do differently, and that's particularly in relation to sort of advertising and searches. And then we'll be addressing our unconscious bias, and that's at all the various different stages across the recruitment process.
So as recruiters, I think I mentioned this previously, we know the value of making sure that diversity and inclusion is considered at all stages of the recruitment process. So from writing the job spec through to appointment, and just as important, the retention of talent. And as we're privileged as recruiters to be able to make an impact on achieving diversity and inclusion goals. Recently, we've really noticed the demand increase for diverse shortlists. I think this is highlighted really well by this graph from LinkedIn here. As you can see, the demand for diversity roles within organisations has absolutely kind of skyrocketed recently, and so lots of organisations have got individuals who are responsible for diversity and inclusion strategy, and we're seeing the impact of that in the shortlist. As an organisation, Goodman Masson's put a lot of investment into understanding best practice from the recruitment process, something that is constantly evolving and we're developing. And I think we see that it's really important that actually it's a collective effort, that we work in partnership with clients, experts in this field, to actually share knowledge of best practice and all kind of move forward together. Lenna, one thing I wanted to really focus on from conversations with clients so far, there's a lot of confusion around positive action, the difference between positive action and positive discrimination, what it is, when you can use it. So it'd be really useful if you could give a bit of an overview of positive action.
Absolutely, yeah, and you're absolutely right, Catherine, in terms of the way that we can implement and utilise positive action is such a really proactive way of addressing diversity and inclusion. It should be a real core component of who we are and what we do in this area. Positive action versus positive discrimination is a really key point to make, because positive discrimination in the UK is illegal, whereas in other areas such as the US, positive discrimination is a norm. So positive action is an opportunity to take a look at when you've got two different candidates, for example, who have an equal level of merit in your application pool. So if you've got two different candidates who both reach the standards you expect at about the same level, if they're reaching the same level in terms of their equality of merit that they've got, then if one has a particular protected characteristic, then that can be a way of breaking a tie between two different candidates. So it's really key area that we can use in terms of providing opportunities for people from a protected characteristic group or who are particularly disadvantaged or underrepresented in your demographic pool.
Okay, and what do you need to do to be able to use positive action or to kind of start positive action?
This is where we get into data points that we raised earlier on. This is where you really need to start examining the data and the information that you have available to you and to start collecting the data so that you can use it. And we'll give you an example of that shortly as well. But where are you finding demographic underrepresentation? Are you asking the people who you're hiring? Are you asking your applicants? Really examining and finding out where those gaps in your data are.
Yeah, and a couple of examples of questions which have recently come up. So when can you use positive action?
Across the board in terms of your application process. Sorry to interrupt, but it's something you can use from the very beginning, even when you start at advertising level, if you're looking at specialist networks, and we'll come back to that as well in a moment, but you can use it at your shortlist, for example, if you wanted to use no single sex shortlist, but you can also use it at that offer point when you're making that decision making point between the difference between two candidates, where you've got that two candidate tie break and you want to decide who it is. And so all those levels are opportunities for you to use a positive action.
So right throughout the recruitment process, I think is the important point there.
Yeah.
And another question that I've had this recently. So can a client ask for an all-female shortlist?
It may be that you get an all-female shortlist from a recruiter like Goodman Masson. And one of the really good things about using a recruiter who does really good work in this area, so Goodman Masson have done positive action training for all of their teams, it means that you'll get a really good candidate pool. But that's that really important distinction between positive action and positive discrimination. Your candidates you'll get, we can't choose a candidate based on their gender alone unless it's to distinguish between equal merited candidates.
Yeah, so I think, if a kind of line manager comes to me and says, I want an all-female shortlist, they can definitely ask for that shortlist if they've identified the underrepresentation of female talent. I guess my response as a recruiter is, look, I will work to provide you a shortlist. They will, if they are all females, they will be the best candidates or of equal measure, but I can't guarantee it because, then we're getting into the territory of discrimination. Is that correct? Yeah,
exactly.
And then I think any more examples? You mentioned single sex shortlists there.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Positive action.
I mean, a couple of different ones included if you're going to have one individual, if you've got a shortlist of all men, and make sure that you include a woman on that list to make sure that you are including a demographic representation. I think the key thing there is the proportionality, what's appropriate for the circumstances that you're in. Positive action has a really loose level of restrictions around what it can be, and so you can be quite flexible how you engage with it. And so it's about making sure that you've used a proportionate response to the underrepresentation or disadvantage that your groups are finding. So another example is subgroups that were from a nominations committee that were looking at saying, okay, well, we're going to have a subgroup that looks for women because we have an underrepresentation of women. So you want to increase the pool of people in that applicant pool who are female, and then you want to increase from any other demographics in the similar ways.
Yeah, I think that was the thing that, once I started exploring positive action, we have more training on it, the flexibility that the law allows around it to make sure, like you say, there's got to be a kind of common sense kind of justification that the action that you've taken is reasonable, but the law is fairly flexible, and I guess that's where the kind of the complexity of it kind of comes in for people.
Exactly.
But I think to kind of highlight here, as recruiters, we definitely think, use it when you can. And I think it's probably not utilised as much as it could be at the moment in the market, and hopefully something that we see grow as more organisations have got a focus on diversity and inclusion and how to improve their workforce.
Yeah, absolutely.
So moving on now to advertising, I think if we keep doing this advertising in the same places and writing the same kind of adverts, we're going to get the same results. So if we're looking to kind of change the talent pools that we're attracting, I think one of the things that we make sure we do on adverts is make sure we've got an ED&I statement. I think making sure that statement is authentic to your organisation is really important.
Absolutely.
And I think linked to that, Glassdoor highlight that from research has shown that applicants will only apply, 73% of applicants apply when they can see that their values align to an advert. I think, that backs up the importance of making sure that your company's got a clear ED&I statement. I think another question that's important to ask yourself in your adverts is, where is your advert reaching? What talent pool is it reaching? So have you gone out of your way to build new networks and reach new talent pools that you perhaps weren't getting your advert to before? So this is an area that Goodman Masson's recently done a lot of work in, building new networks. And then I think another really important area is actually challenging the criteria that goes into those adverts. So we know research written in a binary way when we're talking about men and women, because that's the way the research is written. But the research shows that men will apply when they meet 60% of the criteria, but women will only apply when they meet to the criteria. So really kind of thinking about the criteria, is it essential to kind of broaden the brief and actually hopefully increase the pool of females that are applying. Again, with language, we know that talking about the way that men and women respond to certain words has been researched, and the research tells us that certain words feel. There's lots of developments in technology now which will analyze your advert. So any advert that someone at Goodman Masson posts will go through a gender decoder, and will work we can change those kind of gendered words to make it a more neutral advert. And I think another important thing is avoiding tokenism. So I think in some, you see examples of where it might say, we encourage BAME employees to apply. I think it's important to make sure that people aren't feeling like there might be a diversity hire. So we would suggest avoiding that. Growth mindset versus fixed mindset. So making sure that your language is focused on a growth mindset. A good example of this might be, a growth mindset might be highlighting the opportunity to grow and talking about the potential skills that can be developed, whereas a fixed mindset is talking about focused on perceived characteristics that already are inherent. So for example, you might ask for an expert in their field, and I think thinking about the types of language that is going into your adverts, in a similar vein, looking at ableist, making sure you use ableist language. So it might be that you previously wrote speaks with stakeholders, you'd want to change that to communicates with stakeholders, or you might have previously written see trends and you change that to identify trends, just to make sure you're being inclusive there. And then in a similar vein, in terms of, if we move on from advertising to thinking about searching, again, if we search in the same way, you're going to come up with the same results. So expanding techniques beyond traditional search techniques. So LinkedIn, for example, one thing that Goodman Masson's invested in is understanding advanced search criteria. So being able to actually search for more females. So there's markets that we understand that we've got underrepresentation of female candidates. So one thing that the Equal Opportunities Act allows us to do is actually proactively put effort into searching for more female talent to diversify our talent pool. So something that we've done recently, and I think in line with that is actually building networks of diverse talent, as I mentioned earlier. So those networks, a lot of them already exist, so it's actually putting the time and energy into building relationships with those networks. There's a couple of examples there that, you know, for example, one of my teams focuses on social housing. All those networks and networks that we've recently built partnerships with to be able to share our adverts with people in those networks and those communities. So reducing bias, I'll bring this all up for you so you can talk it through. It's a big area.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of these common discussions that's being had in the sector quite a bit now, in terms of unconscious bias or implicit bias, as some people describe it. And that's based on Project Implicit that's being run by Mazar Banerjee at Harvard University. So that's implicit.harvard.edu. And it's really key to keep in mind and understand that unconscious bias, it will follow you through the process. You can do everything as much as possible to reduce the amount of impact that unconscious bias will have on any system or scenario, but it will follow you through. I mean, for example, the affinity bias is the bias where we choose people who are like us. So did they go to the same university as us? Do they have a similar sporting engagement? activities as us. And it's about remembering that rather than choosing people who are like us or for other reason or excluding people who are not like us, being specifically consciously inclusive. And so including people and making sure they feel like they're welcome and part of who we are. And it's exactly sort of in the ways that Catherine just mentioned in terms of talking about the ableist language and trying to avoid using ableist language that is exclusive to people and it can turn people away. We talked about positive action, and then looking at this discussion around blind CVs, and that's a big one right now. And I think it's quite controversial in some spheres, in some areas. And so what I would recommend is not using it as the one thing that you do. If you're going to use blind CVs, and that means taking away the names from the CV or taking away university from the copy, and so that we don't judge people based on simply on their name or their gender. But if you're going to take that sort of action, then it may be worth considering what else you do in that process. The bias that may influence your decision making at the CV level will influence your decision making at the interview level, at the panel, across the board. So further along the line, you're looking at flexibility of interview times, and so making sure that you're inclusive. You don't know why a person may not be able to do a 9 a.m. interview or do a 4 p.m. interview. Being inclusive and creating space around that. Your interview panel, is it reflective? Does it show who you are, or does it show who you want to be or aspire to be? So having a perspective of not just the people who are interviewing, but also if you're in a room, what do the pictures on the wall say about you? We know that the research suggests that women do much better if they can see themselves represented in the company through the panel or through the room. And then looking at what benefits they're offering. And so as an organisation, what is it that this person feels that they can take away from you as an organisation in terms of benefits that they're gaining?
Yeah, definitely. I think I've definitely seen that shift in the time I've been in recruitment, from companies talking about maternity leave towards shifting talking about parental leave. And I think making sure that benefits are, progressive in that kind of vein. So monitoring and reporting, I guess this is the kind of backbone of everything that we've been talking about. If you don't understand where your shortfalls are, where that underrepresentation is occurring, you can't kind of create strategy and plans as to what you need to do as an organization to actually close the gap on that underrepresentation that might exist. So one thing that Goodman Masson do is at every stage of the recruitment process, we will have a survey that goes out from applicants through to when someone has their CV sent, through to interview, through to when someone's been offered and accepted, to kind of understand, and so to ask people to share their diversity data. I think something that's really important on this forum, and I think you've advised this as well, Lenna, is explaining why you're using that data and what you're doing with that data, so people know that actually there's going to be a benefit to them sharing that data with you. I think once you've got that data, you can then start to analyse, review the data and understand, where the shortfalls come in. I think the question to be asking at that stage is what does good look like? What could be, what's our current state? I think one thing that we've invested in recently is with LinkedIn Talent Insights is to understand what does the gender breakdown for different markets. So for example, you can see here with this is charities finance, you can see as it gets, the more senior the roles get, the fewer females there are. So I think to understand what the market you're transacting in looks like, and to understand your current state, and then actually to start to bridge the gap, and then actually to start to bridge the gap between what's the best, which marketplaces actually have the best female to male representation, actually drive towards that. One thing that you have picked us up, Lenna, is our basic use of gender, traditional gender roles there with that image, and I think it's points to exactly why we need you on board, and the journey that everyone's on in terms of understanding where some of your biases actually exist and things that you just don't even notice. So thanks for that. But yeah, as I mentioned there, once you've kind of identified that, it's about looking at actually where can you find, if you're not getting the talent in the first place, if at the initial stage you're not actually getting a representative talent pool, what do you need to do to access new talent pools? If that talent doesn't exist, what strategies do you need to put in place to bring talent in and train people up? What have you done in terms of building networks, and what targets have you set as an organisation to actually close those gaps? And I think, Lenna, you shared this diagram with me, I think a really good example.
Yeah, and I think it's a way of looking at seeing how you maintain gender balance or whatever underrepresented group you're looking at balance in the pool across all the different stages of the application. So if your application pool has 30, if you have 30 applications in your pool and 20 of them are orange and 10 of them are yellow, for example, with your minority population, what often happens is you get to the end of the recruitment stage and you no longer have any yellow applicants. And so what this shows is that at each level, you can maintain the exact proportion of applicants from each group in this application pool. So 33% demonstrates the balanced process from stage to stage. And that 80% and 50% demonstrates a balanced success rate per group. So it means that you're managing to keep all along that different pathway the representation that you've got of your underrepresented populations.
Yeah, I think this highlights where, you know, at different stages you might apply different approaches of positive action. I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Ways of doing so. Yeah.
And I think, you know, I mentioned at the beginning there, talking about sharing best practice and sharing what people are doing. Just a couple of clients that we've had conversations with or on the PSL as preferred suppliers, Riverside Housing Association, they've called it their BAME strategy. I know that's a debated term, but that's what they've kind of focused on. And their BAME strategy is around, first of all, they didn't have enough senior BAME employees within their organisation. Off the back of the McGregor-Smith report, they identified that. And they set their strategy to be, actually, we need to broaden the criteria of what we're asking for, because to bring talent into the sector, we need to broaden that brief of what we're asking for. Then the other thing they've said they'll do is reverse mentoring. So where we've got that underrepresentation at a senior level, but to have the voices heard of our BAME employees, let's establish BAME mentoring. And then again, positive action around, if people meet the minimum criteria, so that broadened criteria, we will guarantee that anyone who is BAME is interviewed. And then Nest, I think they're a good example, the government pension provider, of they ask us for data on anyone that is seen through the recruitment process. So they monitor people right from application through to acceptance, and then actually beyond that into retention. And they review that data on a quarterly basis and actually set targets off the back of that data. And EY, they're a good example of, they've recently established a scheme where they've committed to 30% of their trainee hires being Black trainees. So I think what Government Mass has committed to do is once a quarter, we're going to share best practice that we come across in the market, and just circulate that across on our diversity and inclusion newsletters.
I think that's a really good way of one of the really important ways of doing this work is being able to share good practice across the sector in terms of what we're seeing other places and what we can try and what may or may not work in what we're doing every day. Yeah, so this has been this has been our half-hour session, a quick one, and we've covered sort of 3 key areas here today, looking at sort of where are the talent gaps and where the gaps in your talent pool are, and how we examine the data in order to identify that. What networks can we identify to access these new talent pools? And so who can we speak to? Who can we look at? What can we really do differently? And then just really being aware of our biases and how what are the biases of our hiring managers, ourselves, and everybody who's involved in the recruitment process.
Yeah, definitely. I think they're 3 great questions to kind of ask yourself and ask hiring managers. You know, if you start with those kind of questions, and this is a question you actually asked me, which I then asked my managers, you know, can your hiring managers communicate your organisation's D&I strategy? And I think, you know, knowing what you're doing and what you're looking to achieve, I think is really important. So thank you very much for that. So we'll move on to, I've got a couple of questions that people have sent in advance. We'll move on to these and then we'll do some live questions. So first of all, how do you ensure that diversity and inclusion is included in the recruitment process fairly, and ensure that you attract a wide variety of candidates without going as far as positive discrimination and quotas? So a pretty big question there.
That's a big question, and I think diversity and inclusion really does start from the very beginning. It starts from when you're writing the application, the criteria, when you're writing the advertising material, when you're setting that up. And, you know, we talked a little bit about positive action and how the difference between that and positive discrimination matters, and how we can implement positive action from the very beginning, from the advertising stage, in terms of reaching different crowds and different organisations, different groups, through to the offer stage, where it becomes a tiebreaker between 2 equal candidates who have, you know, equal merit, but one has from an underrepresented or disadvantaged protected characteristic group.
Yeah, I think you mentioned that, you know, in terms of linking your strategy, positive action and unconscious bias, and the two roles that they play in being thinking about both, and, you know, what are you trying to achieve? And I think
Yes.
that's high break. That's a really good time to kind of ask yourself that question. Another question is, what is best to tackle first? Big question, and that probably feeds more into the diversity and inclusion strategy, but any kind of quick answers to that?
Yeah, there is no one thing. I think one of the only one thing that I might say is the most important thing to start doing is communication. Start with communication. The first message that your team should be looking at is an understanding and knowing is we're doing diversity and inclusion. This is going to be a core part of everything we do going forwards from here. So education is really going to be key. You want to make sure that they're upskilled to a level where they feel comfortable talking about and making decisions about diversity and inclusion.
Yeah. And I think that leads on to actually one client sent a question here. So we've identified that we've got underrepresentation of female talent. We've put strategies in place, but then when we did a survey, our company wasn't aware of these strategies.
And
any advice?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's look at your communication strategy, because how do you communicate internally and externally? What does that look like as an organization? How are you talking to people about the things that you're doing and the work that you're doing? Because if your team don't know about these activities, then how do people outside know about these activities? And so let's look at the overall communications and how we include your diversity initiatives in your overall communication strategy for the organization.
Yeah, okay. And then this is a good one. So how can we best use diversity data?
I love diversity data. It's actually one of my favorite areas. I love my diversity data. Carefully, first of all, carefully, because you have to remember, take into consideration diversity data falls under some of the diversity data falls under general data protection regulations, and so you have to be careful how you use it. It's really important, as Catherine's already said, explain to people why you're using it before you even ask them for it. That's such a key important message to deliver and to have them understand. When they believe you and trust you in terms of what you're saying you're going to do it, people are more likely to give you the information. And then use it on a regular basis. Don't just do it once and then forget about it. Repeat your activities in this and collecting data. Use it, create it, and build it into what you do overall and generally into your strategy.
And I think you mentioned to me about how looking at how it breaks down into different groups, you know, the different levels of the data cutting is, you know, another thing to kind of think about. Again, a bigger topic in its own right, I imagine.
Absolutely, it's really careful. You have to really be careful about it. And so, for example, if we talk about the Black, Asian, minority, ethnic group, the acronym that's used.
Yeah, and then final question from the pre-selected ones. So how can you ensure we're selecting the right people groups? You know, the different levels of the data cutting is, you know, another thing to kind of think about. Again, a bigger topic in its own right, I imagine.
Absolutely, it's really careful. You have to really be careful about it. And so, for example, if we talk about the Black, Asian, minority, ethnic group, the acronym that's used so often in this area, what often that happens, the reason why that's used is because you think small numbers will put everybody together. The problem is those individual groups and networks are not going to necessarily have the same experiences. For example, if you look at university data, we know that for white populations closer to Asian populations in terms of success rate and job rating than they are to Black populations. So really looking at the differences between those demographic groups, in addition to looking at them as a larger proportion when you are.
Yeah, and then final question from the pre-selected ones. So how can you ensure we're selecting the right people to partner with? So for example, agencies, what should we look for?
Don't take one person's word for anything. I would do your due diligence as you would do with any other organization. And look, when you find somebody, when somebody recommends you and references somebody, look them up, talk to other people, have a word, checking with them. don't remember that not one group never represents all groups, and so you must, you know, take that into account with whatever information they give you. If something they're saying doesn't sound quite right, then check it with other groups and organizations as well.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much. I know initially when we launched this, it was just going to be me, and I know I feel very lucky to have had you on the call. So thanks for joining us today. We'll stay on the line now for a couple of live questions. Thanks very much, Lenna.
Thank you.
So there's obviously a lot of questions kind of coming, as everyone can see, and I think we're about at time. So I think I'll do one quick one to kind of wrap up, and then I think what we'll do is collate all the questions. We've got one more webinar tomorrow. We'll collate all the questions and actually send out a summary of the Q&A and provide some kind of written answers, just so that we're not leaving any questions unanswered. I think just to pick one, in terms of pronouns, that's something that I've recently myself been learning about and kind of researching. And one thing that Goodman Masson's done recently is set up a group, so Pride at Goodman Masson, for our LGBTQ plus employees and their allies. And there's been a lot of talk about pronouns. I think one of the biggest kind of reasons, I guess, to kind of think about pronouns and perhaps put it on your sign off is, you know, to give that kind of support to your colleagues that, you know, previously might have felt uncomfortable, and make sure that you are kind of showing your support there. I think a good example someone gave me was, you know, historically using the term Miss, MISS, seemed crazy, you know, back in the day. And, you know, we're all kind of developing and learning, you know, what is needed to make people feel included. And I think that was quite a good example of where over time what becomes the norm really does change, and definitely something that, you know, as an organisation we've started to kind of move on. But thanks very much for joining us today. I hope there's been some useful insight there. As I mentioned, we'll collate the questions and we'll share the slides on our LinkedIn, and kind of you can all see those. If anyone has any kind of follow-up that they want, feel free to get in touch with either myself, which is catherine.kellaway@goodmanmasson.com, or reach out to your kind of point of contact, and we'll work together to come back and answer those questions with you. But thanks very much for your time today, everyone. Hope that was a useful webinar.